Hello and welcome to Impact of Racism on Community Health, which is the fourth webinar of the Combating Racism in Libraries Part 2 series. This webinar series is sponsored by the Ethnic Services Roundtable, the Public Library section, and the Instruction, Development, Equity, and Access section. Thank you for attending this webinar on these very important topics. Before we introduce our speaker, just a few housekeeping notes. Please be sure that your microphone and camera are off during the duration of the webinar. This will help us to improve the video and sound quality during the presentation. Please feel free to use the chat and/or the question and answer section with any questions or comments you have throughout the webinar, and we will take the time at the end of the presentation to answer your questions. And this webinar and all webinars in our series are being recorded, and all recordings will be shared with our attendees about a week after the presentation. We also have a follow-up survey that we send out directly after the webinar, and please fill those out. Your feedback is very important to us and how we can shape the future of these webinar series. Today's session, Impact of Racism on Community Health, speaker is Dr. Joseph Graves, Jr., whom Casper is now going to introduce.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be with you here virtually. My name is Casper Jarecki. I am the library manager for Queens Public Library, and I'm the membership chair of the Ethnic Services Roundtable. And as membership chair, I invite you to join the Ethnic Services Roundtable. This is a great way for you to support events like this one and help us plan future events. I'm so pleased to introduce the fourth session of our Combating Racism webinar series, Impact of Racism on Community Health with Dr. Joseph Graves, Jr. The Combating Racism series is brought to you by the Public Library section, the Ethnic Services Roundtable, Instruction, Development, Equity, and Access section, and the New York Library Association. United, we value diversity, equity, inclusion, and stand against racism, hatred, and violence. I am pleased to be here today with Dr. Graves, Jr. I got to interview Dr. Graves about his book, Racism Not Race, which is a really great book. For Queens Public Library's Literary Thursday series, and Dr. Graves even played chess with our Library Chess Club virtually. So thank you, Dr. Graves, for supporting libraries and joining events like this one. Dr. Joseph Graves, Jr. is a professor of biological sciences at North Carolina A&T State University. In 2017, he was listed as an outstanding graduate in biology at Oberlin College and was an Innovator of the Year in U.S. Black Engineer magazine. His books on the biology of race are entitled The Emperor's New Clothes, The Race Myth, and Racism Not Race. Racism Not Race was named by Kirkus Reviews as one of the best nonfiction books of 2021, and its best books about being Black in America 2021. Finally, his biopic work entitled A Voice in the Wilderness is scheduled to be for publication in fall 2022. So thank you so much, Dr. Graves, for all you do. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Casper. So I'm going to go full screen now, and hopefully you can all see that. So we're going to talk about the impact of racism on community health. And I began to think about why and how people thought racially in our society in the early 1990s. This led to 3 books, the first of which, The Emperor's New Clothes, was published in 2001. I included a chapter in The Emperor's New Clothes on the ongoing misconceptions about race in biomedical research. I followed it up a few years later with The Race Myth, which also provides the reader an understanding of the ongoing pathologies associated with racial thinking in American society in particular. It contained a chapter on essentially, as I remember the title, it was America is Enough to Make You Sick. which described how structural racism contributes to the ongoing health disparities that we see in modern society. Now, after writing The Race Myth, I really thought that I would never have to write another book on this subject again, but the world moved on, and we found ourselves at the beginning of the second decade of the 21st century, not having progressed very far from our understanding of racism that we had achieved in the 20th century. And so that led to working on Racism Not Race with my good colleague, Dr. Alan Goodman. And we wanted in this book to give people simple and accessible answers to consistently asked questions that we had faced over the majority of our career. So if you don't know the book, please check it out. Casper has told you about its accolades that was reviewed in the journal Science. And pretty much everything I'm going to talk about today are dealt with in Racism Not Race. The next book in this series is A Voice in the Wilderness, and we now have a publication date for that. It's September 13th, 2022, and it's already selling, pre-copies are selling online. Now, in terms of resources that you hopefully might know about, but if not, certainly you should visit the Race Are We So Different website, which was put together by the American Anthropological Association. Also, a collection of essays solicited by the Social Science Research Council entitled Is Race Real? The documentary film Race, Power of an Illusion is still undoubtedly the best documentary on race and racism that's ever been put together. Although part one, which deals with the biology and genetics of human variation, is somewhat dated. This all came out before the publication of the Human Genome, but everything that's happened since the publication of the Human Genome has further validated all of the points we made in that documentary. So I still recommend it as a very valuable resource. There's also the Encyclopedia of Race and Racism. The second edition is measurably better than the first, not just because I was the editor involved in putting together all of the pieces in genetics, evolution, and anthropology. So if you don't know this work, certainly this should be in your library. It's very valuable to give readers a quick set of answers to questions that they might have about areas associated with race and racism. All right, so I often have to explain to people how racial thinking developed in the Western world. And particularly, I spend some amount of time discussing its origins in Christian thought. And so many people come at our modern understanding of race thinking that it was always part of modern biology as we understand it. In fact, that is absolutely wrong. So the first discussions of human biological variation in the Western world were associated with the prevailing view of nature, which was special creationist, and these new people who were being, quote, discovered by Europeans had to fit into their Christian worldview in some way. Now, the original thinking was that these people were the offspring of Adam and Eve through the Great Flood, and that Noah's sons had given rise to all the various people on the planet. Now, this view was called monogenism, in which there was one original pair, the Great Flood, which wiped out a whole bunch of folks, and the descendants of Noah repopulating the earth. However, another view, another religious idea, Christian religious idea about the origin of the different people that they were coming in contact with was known as polygenism. In polygenism, God had created different sets of Adam and Eves. And so these different people that Europeans came in contact with were actually not members of the same species as them, as they were derived from separate special creations. Now, by the 19th century, polygenism was the predominant ideology in both England and the United States. So this idea also influenced the thinking of physicians who, are nominally associated with the natural science of their time, at least at this time, nominally associated. Medicine really didn't become a science again in the way we know it until into the 20th century. So here are some physician beliefs about Africans and Europeans. So in 1799, it was thought that Africans and Europeans generally suffered from the same diseases and disabilities. However, some of these were unique to Africans. William Harvey and John Lindsay in that year coined the disease Cachexia africana, or dirt eating, which they saw as associated with emotional distress and depression. Now, it turns out that dirt eating is a common cultural practice in the tropics, and it's usually associated with people having low iron and therefore eating soil to try to increase their iron content. But of course, Harvey and Lindsay didn't know that. In 1826, Tiedemann discussed how the darker skin allowed Africans to withstand heat and humid conditions better than Europeans, and he's essentially correct in that having darker skin certainly helps you with regard to being able to handle, continual sunlight, but not in the ways that he would have thought it was capable of. Now, one of the most well-known physicians of the mid-19th century was Samuel Cartwright. Now, Samuel Cartwright was well respected in the medical profession, not just in the slaveholding South, but also in the non-slaveholding North. He wrote some very important papers on how to revive drowning victims. So he was, a physician of his time and a well-regarded one. Now, he thought that Negro consumption, which refers to tuberculosis, was somehow different from white consumption. He also coined the disease drapetomania, which he called the irrational desire of Negroes to run away from slavery, and also dysthesia, which was a disease that caused slaves to perform tasks in a haphazard manner. Now, Cartwright's treatment for these conditions was simply for the slave owners to be nicer to their slaves, therefore curing these diseases, because after all, why would anybody want to be free? Now, unfortunately, and this may surprise some of you, that medical thinking about race really didn't change much from Cartwright's time to the 21st century. So on May 5th, 2002, Sally Seitel, a member of the American Enterprise Institute and a lecturer at Yale's University School of Medicine, says that she was a racially profiling doctor. In quote, "In practicing medicine, I am not colorblind. I always take note of my patient's race. So do many of my colleagues. We do it because certain diseases and treatment responses cluster by ethnicity." Now, in this statement, Seitel illustrates her confusion in that she doesn't understand the difference between the concept of race and the concept of ethnicity, which are not the same thing. Now, in a study that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2016, faculty members at University of Virginia's medical school examined a variety of racial misconceptions about people that were harbored amongst their medical students. Now, I want to be clear, if you were unaware of the fact that the University of Virginia's medical school is one of the best medical schools in the world, and a third of their first-year medical students thought that blacks aged more slowly than whites. This was actually not improved in second-year medicine, where 38.9% of them felt that way. Residents who come from medical programs other than that of UVA, 50% of the residents felt that blacks aged more slowly than whites. Now, one of the most insidious of these misconceptions was the idea that black nerve endings were less sensitive than whites. And this was held again by 12.7% of the first years and 19.4% of the second years. Now in the UVA program, they, managed to repair that misconception by the third year of medical school. But again, many of the residents, 14.3%, felt that way. Now, the reason this is so important is because this misconception actually led and still leads to African American patients being less likely to receive pain medication because physicians feel that they don't feel pain as acutely as whites do. Other misconceptions: black blood coagulates more quickly than whites, black skin is thicker than white, blacks have stronger immune systems than whites. All of these things are based on, again, a lack of attention in undergraduate course preparation in regard to human biological variation, what it is and what it is not. So in March of 2021, New England Journal of Medicine, and again, this focus really resulted from the murder of George Floyd and a number of different professions trying to look inward towards how they were dealing with race, published one called Embracing Genetic Diversity to Improve Black Health. Now, the authors of this piece stated either the use of race in clinical practice and biomedical research has substantial benefits, or race has no biologic basis and thus no place in medicine. Now, most of these authors were themselves persons of African descent, but in this statement, they once again demonstrated their lack of understanding about what the concept of race is and how it operates with regard to health disparities. Now, in that piece, they cited University of California, San Francisco researcher Esteban Burchard, who supported the first position, that race is very useful in clinical practice, and that of my colleagues Richard Cooper and Jay Kaufman to support the second claim that race has no biologic basis and thus no place in medicine. I fall into that second category, and I'm going to explain that to you in the balance of this talk today. They also concluded that because self-identified race and ancestral origin are strongly correlated, that race had both a genetic and a social component. Now, earlier this year, in a perspective piece published in the New England Journal of Medicine, along with my colleague, Dr. Andrea Dayrup, who is a professor of pathology at Duke University, we explained this ongoing medical misconceptions about human biological variation. We published this perspective piece because of our experience giving a series of grand round lectures at some of the most prestigious medical colleges across the nation. So Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Duke, Emory, University of Chicago, I can go on and on. In fact, I've lost track of all of the medical schools that I've given this talk to this year, where their physicians were very much like those medical students who were described on the slide from the University of Virginia. So, and here's the problem, okay? People continue to confuse the biological race concept which has a history, part of which I described earlier in this discussion, that goes back to the beginning of the colonial period, the age of European expansion, where people look different and races were defined by how they look, what we call morphology. In the 19th century, these ideas moved on to the geographical location of these people. In the 20th century, after what is called the neo-Darwinian synthesis, in which Mendelian genetics and Darwinian natural selection are unified in one coherent theory, the biological race concept becomes based upon populations and the frequency of genes in those populations. And later on in the 20th century, with the development of phylogenetic techniques, races are thought to be unique evolutionary lineages within species. Now, this concept is very different from socially constructed or socially defined race. Now, this concept arbitrarily utilizes aspects of morphology, geography, culture, language, religion, or any other aspect of human existence, but it only does so in the service of a social dominance hierarchy. In other words, the reason that Alan and I titled our latest book, Racism, Not Race, is because it was racism that drove the creation of the socially defined racial groups that exist in our society, not the underlying biological variation within the human species. And so this concept only exists to maintain social dominance. In other words, to determine who is worthy in a society and who is not worthy based upon some supposedly inherent and inherited set of characteristics. Now, early on in the 20th century, biologists actually understood that this idea was thoroughly wrong. So Ernst Mayr, one of the architects of the neo-Darwinian synthesis, noted that the term subspecies, which is equivalent to what we call a geographical race, had come into common usage in the 19th century, replacing the notion of the variety. Now, the concept of subspecies is fallacious, he said. The better the geographical variation of the species is known, the more difficult it becomes to delimit subspecies, and the more obvious it becomes that many such delimitations are quite arbitrary. So this was published in his book, Population, Species, and Evolution in 1974. What he's essentially saying is that biological variation within most species is continuous, and particularly in the case of humans. Now, I'm quickly going to run through for you how we determine that using non-arbitrary methods. So it's one thing to say, well, yeah, the delimitations are arbitrary. It's another thing to develop mathematical and statistical tools to determine whether such delineations make any sense or not. So to do that, I'm going to quickly talk to you about another one of the architects of the neo-Darwinian synthesis, American geneticist Sewell Wright. And he developed a set of statistics to look at the genetic variation in a species at different levels. First level would be the level of local populations. The second level would be the level of regional populations or continental populations. And then the third level would be the entire species. So with this statistic, the FST, which is given here, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the math of this, but basically it allows one to look at the difference in the genetic variability between the total species and its subpopulations. Now, this can be done across a number of genetic locations, and you're probably all familiar that the chromosomes of organisms like ourselves have genes on them. And for humans, there are 19,000 protein coding genes. So we could look at the average for this across the entire genome, or we could look at this quantity for any specific gene. So what Wright reasoned again, using somewhat eloquent mathematics, was that at the value of 0.250, or about 1/4, if your FST statistic was higher than that, then you definitely had strong evidence for the existence of biological or geographical races. Now, if you look at that quantity on the slide, you'll realize that at the highest level, the FST statistic can be 1. And what that means is that there's complete and total subdivision within your species. So all of your subpopulations are dramatically different from each other. At the lowest level, the FST value is 0, meaning that you have a completely panmictic population that really isn't divided into subpopulations at all. So Wright says about 1/4, which is between the extremes of 0 and 1, you have a value that says, if you're above that, you probably have geographical races within your species. So this is something we can actually measure. So we're no longer in the zone of arbitrary classification based upon this physical trait or that physical trait. So when we look at humans, what did we find? Well, first, let me give you an example of what this would look like, and then I'll tell you, what the data shows us. So on the left-hand side of the slide, you see 5 different subpopulations whose gene frequencies for a given variant are essentially the same. So if you were to calculate the FST statistic from this kind of data, you would get a very low FST level, certainly well below the 0.250, which is our cutoff for saying that a species has geographical races. On the right side of this panel, you see 5 populations that have dramatically different gene frequencies. And if you calculate the FST value for such a locus, you would find that the FST value is very high. Now, on the bottom panel here, I give you a real world example of a high FST. For example, the MC1R gene plays a role in producing fair skin. There's a very high FST value between people who live in the temperate zones of Eurasia and people who live in tropical regions. Now, note that I said tropical regions, not Africa, because that includes Central America, it includes tropical Africa, it includes Saudi Arabia, it includes India, it includes the Far East, it includes the Pacific. So if you look at this gene between Eurasia and tropical regions, you see that they're very different. So the panel on the left-hand side, the yellow variant, which is the C nucleotide, is a very high frequency in tropical Africa. If you look at the right-hand side, the green variant, which is a T nucleotide, is a very high frequency in Europe. And so, not surprisingly, your eyes would tell you that people in Europe have light skin, okay? People in Africa, tropical Africa, tend to have dark skin. But what you don't really see is the gradation in skin color and the gradation in gene frequency that occurs between tropical Africa and Northern Europe. Now, this is a gene where we certainly say we have high FST. This is not controversial. Now, when we look at the genome as a whole, we find that human population subdivision is very weak. And it also depends upon how it's measured. So if we look at the left-hand table, which looks at FST in protein coding regions from 5 chromosomes, comparing African and European samples, and we're looking at now thousands of genetic markers, the FST values are all lower than 0.103, which is much lower than Wright's threshold, in which you would claim, oh, you have biological races. On the right-hand side, we have the FST statistic from non-coding regions. Non-coding regions can accumulate more genetic variation because they don't make anything. And so a mutation there would not be natural selection at all. And since the majority of the human genome is non-coding, you see that the N value for these non-coding regions is on the order of, 65, 82,000, as opposed to only 1,000 in the coding regions. But once again, we still don't see a FST value greater than Wright's threshold of 0.250. And from this, we conclude that Africans and Europeans are not geographical races. Now, we can also look at this statistic globally. So in the bottom panel of this slide, we see FST values plotted against distance from East Africa. Now, for those of you who are unaware why we root this on East Africa, we know that the human species, our species, anatomically modern humans, first evolved in East Africa, and then it migrated around the world over the course of around 100,000 to 70,000 years. And that's what's responsible for the genetic differences that we see in human populations. Now, when we plot these FST values pairwise between different human populations based upon their geographical distance, what do we find? We find that populations that live close to each other share more genetic variants in common, and therefore their FST values are very low. When the distances between those populations get very great, like Central Africa and Mexico, we see the FST values get higher, but they never exceed Wright's threshold value of 0.250. In other words, we have continuous variation in human populations that is associated with the migratory path out of East Africa, which began some 70,000 to 100,000 years ago. But none of these things are clustered into discrete groups, meaning that any such choice of saying, well, this group is a race, that group is a race, is entirely arbitrary, as the great theorist Ernst Mayr said in the latter portion of the 20th century. And that was before we had all this genomic data. So at the end of the day, human beings do not have biological races. We do have geographically based genetic variation, and some of that is important in terms of telling us about potential disease risk, but we can't define ourselves into these racial groups that we have socially created. Our underlying biology simply does not allow that. Now, and when you look at biological variation, we come to conclusions that are very different from our social ones. For example, when we look at these pairwise FST values, we find that sub-Saharan African hunter-gatherers are greater in distance than sub-Saharan farmers and Europeans. In other words, sub-Saharan farmers and Europeans are closer to each other genetically than either group is to sub-Saharan African hunter-gatherers. So, for example, the Sandawe are closer to Europeans than they are to the Hadza. The Hadza are hunter-gatherers. The Sandawe are farmers, and genetically they're actually closer to Sardinians, Middle Easterners, Mediterranean populations who you would call Caucasians or Europeans than they are to the Hadza, who you would call African or Black. So once again, once we look at the underlying biological genetic variation, we come to very different conclusions than our social conventions. So now this is further complicated by the fact that the groups that exist in America are what we call in genetics admixed. In other words, people that are socially defined or self-identified as African Americans have different percentages of European ancestry. Now this occurred during chattel slavery by the forced rape of African women by slave masters. So we know this from a number of lines of genetic evidence. We know this from historical narratives and so on. Now, that percentage of European ancestry for African Americans on the whole is on the average of 16%. But it differs by region of the country. So for example, in West Virginia, African Americans have in excess of 30% European ancestry, similarly to what we find in Washington State. Now, if we look at Latinos, their admixture is a triad mixture from European ancestry, Amerindian ancestry, and African ancestry. And Latino populations vary between 65% to 85% European. Now, this of course can differ dramatically based upon country. So in Puerto Rico, individuals there on average have 72% European ancestry, about 16% Amerindian ancestry, and about 12% African ancestry. But if you compare them to Mexican Americans, who are the largest group of Latinos in the United States, Mexicans are 51% Amerindian and 48% European. Now, if we look at the country of Peru, those people are 80% Amerindian in ancestry and only about 18% European. In Colombia, you have figures closer to that of Puerto Rico. But within the nation of Colombia, you can see dramatic differences based on which state or city. So in this example, we can see on the right-hand side, the city of Medellin, which shows sort of the national percentage of African, European, and Native American ancestry. But right next to it is the state of Choco. Choco was a site of plantation agriculture, and those individuals have a very high percentage of African ancestry, similar to African Americans, but they actually have more American Indian ancestry than African Americans do. So quite frankly, the admixture percentages of Latinos depend very much upon the history of the region in question, particularly with regard to both the native population and the importation of enslaved Africans that made up the populations that lived there. Now, as I pointed out before, we do have examples of strong genetic difference for specific traits that occur across the world. And some of these are things that you would not be surprised when I tell you. So for example, in tropical regions, there are strong examples of adaptation to malaria. Malaria was and still is a major cause of death in the tropics. Now, these genetic variations are found in tropical Africa, they're found in Southern Europe, they're found in the Middle East, they're found in India, all the way over to Indochina. Now, this map doesn't show you that, but their geographic variation is essentially the same as the presence of malaria. We also have things that are single gene adaptations to things like altitude. So we find that in the East African Plateau, we find that in the Himalayas, we find that in the Andes Plateau, and these are similar genetic variations, although in the case of the Himalayan adaptation, it actually originated in a different species of humans that we call the Denisovans, whereas the Andes and African variants originated in our species, Homo sapiens. There are other examples of adaptation. Some of these can be predisposing to disease. Some of them are not, such as lactase resistance, which is found in Northern Europe, but it's also found in East Africa. So these are, again, are not in any way directly mapping upon these socially conceived ideas of race. Now, I'm going to end with talking about, how does disease happen? And this really comes back to the theme that this talk is about, which is, what happens to communities because of structural racism. So, diseases can be influenced by three things: an individual's genes, the environment that they live in, and in some cases, just bad luck. Now, when we look at genetic traits, there are basically two different types. Genes that are what we call simple Mendelian traits, which are determined basically by one genetic loci, as the traits on this slide show. Okay, almost every trait here is really influenced predominantly by one or a couple of genes, or quantitative genetics, in which the trait is influenced by the action of many genes across the genome. Now, the main health disparities we see in American society fall into the latter category. In other words, they're influenced by many genes operating across the genome in conjunction with the environment in which a person lives in. Okay, so to get that, again, I put a complicated equation on the slide, but I'm going to make this as easy as I can. So if we look at the variation in a particular trait symbolized by V sub P, that's determined by an individual's genes, VG, an individual's environment, VE, the interaction of their genes with their environment, G by E, but also this fourth term, which is extremely important, the covariance of genes and environment. And what that term means is that the environment can change in a particular way, and the genetic variation changes in a particular way. So if the genetic variation and the environment are positively associated with each other, okay, we would say that's a positive covariance. So if good, quote, good genes and good environment appear in the same place, positive covariance. But sometimes you can have good genes and you can be associated in a terrible environment, and that would give you a negative covariance. And finally, the final term of this equation is error. And that has to do with how a particular trait is measured. Now, we have seen over the last couple of years several significant examples of how medical conditions have been incorrectly diagnosed. And that's your error term. And I'm going to give you one that should jump out right out at you. So just recently, the NFL Players Association settled a suit with the National Football League on how traumatic brain injury was diagnosed differently between African American players or players of African descent and European American or players of European descent. What this algorithm assumed was that Africans had a lower brain function to begin with. And so therefore, what looked like brain injury for a European person wouldn't have been brain injury for an African person, because that African person's brain didn't operate as well as the European one to begin with. And you may be sitting there in your seat going, WTF. Yes, they really did start with that assumption. That's an example of an error in assumptions that influence the way a particular medical condition was diagnosed. There's other examples of this, including lung function, kidney function, etc. Now, the final term on this page has to do with heritability. Heritability is the degree to which a trait is passed on from parents to their offspring. And it essentially says the genetic variation divided by all the other sources of variation tells us how likely that trait is passed on or from parents to offspring, and how much of the manifestation of that trait can be thought to be associated with genetic difference. Now, one of the things that we see right away is when we look at the heritability for lifespan or longevity, that it differs for socially defined races in the United States. Now, you probably are aware of the fact that there are different life expectancies by socially defined race in the United States. So what this study showed, and this was conducted in New York City, was that European Americans had a very high heritability of their lifespan, meaning that they were living up more to their genetic potential than either Caribbean Hispanics, whose heritability was only 0.15, or African Americans, whose heritability was only 0.1. So what this was telling us is that the environment here was making a differential impact on these different socially defined races with regard to how long they lived. Now, a number of studies from this time period, which I list on the slide, show that this can't be attributed to some inherent genetic inferiority of Africans. And this is shown by the fact that people who are born in Africa show much better health profiles than people born in Africa who then migrate to the United States. Once those people migrate to the United States and have been living here for an extended period of time, they begin to take on the health profiles of African Americans. So in other words, their health profile changed not because of their inherent genes, because they didn't leave their genes behind in Africa. Excuse me. What changed was living in the United States, where structural racism was a constant feature of what they had to experience. Another example that demonstrates that these differences in health profiles we see are driven by environment and not genetics is a study that looked at the amount of genetic variation in Europeans and Africans that is likely to be bad. So with modern bioinformatic tools, you could look at substitutions across the genome for African Americans, European Americans, and you can ask the question, are these likely to be bad or are they likely to be really bad? So on the left side hand panel, we look at genetic variations across both genomes that are possibly bad. And it turns out that there's no statistical difference between African Americans and European Americans for genetic sites where substitutions occurred that are possibly bad. But when we look at genetic sites that are probably bad, it turns out that there is a statistical difference, but it's in the opposite direction of our health disparities. In other words, European Americans show more probably bad genetic substitutions than African Americans do. And so therefore, if genes were determining health profile, we would expect European Americans to be displaying worse health than African Americans. But in fact, we see the exact opposite. So now, one trait that you might have heard about is low birth weight. So I'm going to end our discussion talking about this quickly. So one of the things we know about the heritability of human birth weight is that it's variable, but it's probably very low, which means genes actually play a very small role in determining human birth weight. So in a study of 70,000 Norwegian parent offspring trios, meaning parents and their two kids, or two parents and their child, sorry, the heritability of low birth weight was 0.25. Now, that was actually a very small study, only a couple of hundred individuals involved. And another study of 23 twin birth cohorts with 24,000 participants from Canada, Sweden, Denmark, and Australia, the heritability of birth weight for boys was only 0.064 to 0.087, and the heritability of birth rate for girls was only 0.48 to 0.079. So I'm going to quickly tell you that heritability has on its low end 0, meaning genes play no role in the trait. On the high end, 1, meaning the trait is entirely determined by genes. So these data show that, yeah, there's some genetic contribution to birth weight, but it's very, very small. Now, it turns out if both parents were low birth weight, their risk of producing a low birth weight child increases, but not dramatically so. Now, what are the environmental risk factors, however, for low birth weight? Well, I've classed them here into 5 categories: infection, pollution, drugs, psychosocial stress, and age. So it turns out that there are a number of infectious diseases that can contribute to low birth weight. Pollution, traffic density is a general variable that accounts for the exposure to atmospheric pollution, such as nitric oxide, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide. There are a number of drugs, tobacco, alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, heroin, that contribute to low birth weight. There's psychosocial stress, such as teenage pregnancy, intimate partner violence, racism, post-traumatic stress disorder. All of those contribute to low birth weight. There's also age factors, such as teenage pregnancy or older maternal age on the other end, shorter interbirth interval, having children way too close together, or long birth interval, having a child and then many, many years later having another child. All of those things are environmental factors that contribute to low birth weight. And so given that the heritability of birth weight is only on the order of maybe 0.1, that means that 90% of this variability is coming from these environmental risk factors. And these are things that are also differentially associated with structural racism. Now, final example demonstrating, once again, that we're dealing with structural racism as opposed to some genetic factor is a study from the 1990s that showed that when you looked at the birth weight distribution for African-born women and African-American women, that African-born women had the same distribution of birth weight as US-born white women. So in other words, there was no birth weight disparity in comparing African-born women and US-born white women. The disparity only comes when you're comparing US-born blacks with US-born whites. Once again, indicating the role of these environmental factors, because again, Africans have a genetic composition closer to African Americans, not exactly the same. But once again, the fact that these women within a generation will start taking on the African American low birth weight profile indicates it's not their genes, it's the structural aspects of their environment which is causing this disease differential. So with that, I've been writing on this problem for most of the 21st century. So my first articles on this appeared back in 2002. These are some more which are listed here. Here are some others, and along with some of the references for this talk. So at this point, I'm happy to stop this, where we go? Stop sharing the screen and to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Graves. Any questions our attendees might have, please type those into the chat bar feature. We'll give them a minute or two here. We do have a question. What can libraries do to help with this?
One of the most important variables in determining health outcomes is education. People who are well educated live much, much longer than people who have less education. So the degree to which libraries contain within their holdings materials that allow people to learn about these issues, and particularly how to maintain their own health, would be a tremendous contributor to helping to get rid of health disparity. If people learn that, well, it's not really something wrong with me, but it is the structural racism that I live with in my place of, and my job, in my city, in my society writ large, that helps people have tools to be able to address the conditions that they're suffering under. So libraries can play a huge role, okay, in helping people learn how they can better protect themselves from the impacts of structural racism.
Thank you so much. So we have about 6 minutes left for any more questions. I'm going to send the link in the chat feature for the next webinar, which is next Wednesday on June 8th, just so You guys can continue to register for the last two in this series. We have another question here. What can you comment about the recent shootings?
Actually, I did comment in an article in BuzzFeed, and rather than me looking for it right now, I'll send it to Casper. So people, in fact, I think I did send it to Casper the other day. But you know, the question that I was asked is, you know, what's behind this Buffalo shooting? And you probably all heard of the Great Replacement theory, which is an idea that's being propagated by modern day white supremacists about how, you know, Jews are attempting to import people into the United States, Africans, Latinos, and other non-European people with this grand plan to replace, you know, Northern European Aryan people. This is not a new idea. This goes back to the 19th century. It's the same ideas that were put forth in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was this czarist forgery designed to misrepresent Jews in Russia so that they could be purged and pogromed. So this is an ongoing, you know, white supremacist trope that somehow, you know, people of color are trying to, quote, replace them. Now, the reality is that because of the demographic shifts in the United States, persons of European descent will no longer be the numerical majority by 2045. And for white supremacists, that's very, very frightening because they're used to having a world in which they call all the shots through their government control of elections and so forth. And that is why, by the way, and we talk about this in the concluding chapter of Racism Not Race, we actually predicted months before the election that Donald Trump would not leave office willingly and would attempt to basically overtake the government, which is exactly what he did. And that, again, comes down to the idea that they understand that they're not going to be able to win elections fairly. And so therefore, they are putting in place voter suppression all over the nation. They're trying to call into question any election they don't win as being fraudulent. And so we're going to see more and more of this, and they're unleashing racist terror against Black and brown populations. This has been happening throughout the history of the nation, and unfortunately, this is going to get worse as we approach 2045.
Thank you, Dr. Graves. And Casper did find the link to that article of yours, so we did share it here in the chat for everyone. And with just a couple minutes left, we'd like to thank you again. This was a really great presentation. So thank you to Dr. Graves and Casper for helping organize this lecture as part of the Combating Racism series. And as a reminder, all of the materials will be shared around to our attendees within a week post recording. And please note that the next session will be Wednesday, June 8th, featuring Jana Alabi, speaking about microaggressions in academic libraries. Please register for this link that was sent around in the chat. And it doesn't appear we have any more questions. So thanks everyone for attending today. And thanks again, Dr. Graves.
Again, thank you for having me, and all the best of luck with this series.